They told the court I was a failure. They cried on cue. They forged documents. And for 5 minutes they almost got away with it. My mother sobbing dramatically with dry eyes. My father nodding like a man betrayed. My brother smiling like the ending was already written. Until the judge stopped reading, removed his glasses, and said one sentence that froze the entire room. I read about this company in Forbes last week. And in that moment, they realized this wasn't a bankruptcy hearing. It was an exposure. So, if you believe people who sabotage others should face consequences, type "justice" in the comments and stay with me. Because what happened next destroyed everything they built their lies on. We gave you every opportunity and you threw it away. My mother sobbed dramatically, dabbing at dry eyes with a designer handkerchief, while the bankruptcy courtroom watched. My father sat beside her, jaw clenched, nodding gravely as their lawyer presented documents claiming I owed my brother Marcus $1.8 million, forged loan agreements, fabricated repayment schedules, financial statements that bore no resemblance to reality. And across the aisle, Marcus sat relaxed in his tailored suit, wearing the quiet confidence of a man who believed the ending had already been written for him, while, beside me, my attorney, Patricia Acuno, remained perfectly calm, her posture controlled, her expression unreadable, her briefcase at her feet, holding evidence that would soon detonate like a bomb in that room. The hearing unfolded like theater. Mother's tears timed perfectly my father's disappointment, practiced to perfection, Marcus whispering to his lawyer as if this were a formality, not a reckoning, until Judge Harrison slowed his reading, removed his glasses, and stared at me with an expression that shifted from neutrality to confusion to disbelief, before calling both counsel to the bench, and I watched the judge lean forward, whispering something that drained the color from Marcus's lawyer's face, a visible shift, the kind you feel before a structure collapses. And when the judge spoke again, his voice carried through the courtroom as he said he had read about Meridian Tech Solutions in Forbes magazine, the cybersecurity startup that had just closed a $94 million contract with the Department of Homeland Security. And in that instant, Marcus's smirk vanished. My mother's sobbing stopped mid-breath. My father's rigid posture collapsed inward, and the courtroom fell into a silence, thick enough to feel heavy on the skin. Someone in this courtroom, the judge continued, is lying to my face, and I intend to find out who. And I stood there silently at the defense table, hands folded, waiting, because this was not the moment they destroyed me. This was the moment they realized the lie built their confidence on was about to become a public exposure, 8 years in the making, because this was never just about money. It was about control. It was about proving that I could not succeed without their permission, that my ambition was a mistake, that walking away from their world was an error that needed to be corrected, and this courtroom was their chosen instrument. My family had not come here to recover a debt. They had come to humiliate me, to reduce my life's work to a footnote, to force my company into insolvency before anyone important could understand what it really was. And the bankruptcy petition had arrived 4 weeks earlier, filed by Marcus, claiming he had invested $1.8 million into Meridian in year 3, and that I had defaulted on repayment, that the company was insolvent, that creditors, I needed court protection. Every word was a lie. Marcus had never invested a dollar. He had never expressed interest beyond mockery. The documents were fabricated from top to bottom, forged signatures, loan agreements, referencing bank accounts that did not exist, financial statements that contradicted every audited record we had. And when I first saw the filing, I did not panic. I called Patricia immediately, and she reviewed it in silence before looking up and saying, "They are attempting to force you into bankruptcy proceedings using forged documents. This is not just stupid, it is criminal forensic analysis. We'll expose this within days, but the filing itself creates complications that could delay your Department of Homeland Security contract implementation." And that was the point. Marcus did not need to win. He needed to interfere, to poison the timeline, to introduce doubt before anyone understood the poison. scale of what I had built, and when I said he must have learned about the contract through a relative who handled compliance paperwork, Patricia nodded and said, "They do not need details. They only need to believe you have something worth destroying." And now they were here, performing grief, performing righteousness, performing concern in front of a judge they believed would never question their narrative, because people like my family were used to being believed. And as Marcus's lawyer described, my failing company, my supposed irresponsibility, my refusal to honor legitimate debts, my mother cried on cue, my father shook his head solemnly, and it would have been convincing if it were not so carefully rehearsed. And when Judge Harrison began reviewing our documentation, his expression shifted from professional detachment to confusion to something harder, something controlled, but unmistakable. And when he called the lawyers to the bench again, Marcus's attorney turned visibly pale, while Patricia remained composed, nodding occasionally. And when the judge spoke again, his voice carried ice as he removed his glasses and looked directly at my brother, stating that the company being claimed as insolvent had Brindis's just secured a $94 million federal contract, and that according to the defendant's documentation, no such investment had ever occurred. Marcus tried to interrupt, claiming I was lying, and the judge cut him off, stating he was looking at audited financials from a Big Four accounting firm, showing $118 million in annual revenue, bank records showing no investment from Marcus, and forensic handwriting analysis concluding every signature on the loan agreements was forged. And in that instant, my mother's performance collapsed entirely. My father stared at the table, and Marcus looked like a man realizing for the first time that entitlement does not survive evidence. And if you are watching this and you have ever been publicly doubted by people who privately benefited from your silence, pause for a moment and type "justice" in the comments. Because what happened next did not just dismantle their lie, it exposed the foundation. Was built on, and this was only the beginning. The reason they believed this would work was not because they were careless, but because they were consistent. For my entire life, my family had operated under one unchallenged assumption: that success belonged to them by default, and that anything I built outside their system was temporary by definition. Meridian Tech Solutions began 9 years earlier, with $14,200 in savings and a laptop held together with duct tape, a detail my family found endlessly amusing, because the Whitmores did not do duct tape. They did polished boardrooms, inherited authority, and the quiet confidence of people who had never needed to prove themselves. My father, Theodore Whitmore, ran one of Boston's most respected wealth management firms and believed markets rewarded pedigree before performance. My brother Marcus was groomed from childhood as his successor, praised for confidence he never earned, shielded from consequences by a last name that opened doors before he ever touched the handle. My younger sister Diana married into pharmaceutical money and spent her days organizing charity galas, where generosity was measured in camera flashes rather than results. And then there was me, Serena Whitmore, the middle child, the misalignment, the embarrassment, who dared to walk away from a Harvard MBA to chase what my father called computer nonsense. I remember standing in his mahogany-paneled office at 25 with my business plan laid neatly across his desk, explaining the gap I saw in cybersecurity for small and mid-sized businesses, how companies without enterprise budgets were being destroyed by breaches they could not even detect, how existing solutions were reactive and overpriced, and how proactive intrusion detection could change that entire segment of the market. He listened without interrupting, and then laughed softly, not cruelly but dismissively, the way men laugh when they do not consider something worth arguing against. "That's a hobby, not a career," he said. "Get a real job, join Marcus at the firm. Stop embarrassing this family with your little experiments." And when I pushed back, when I insisted there was real demand and real money here, he leaned forward and ended the conversation with surgical precision. "There's a massive gap in your understanding of how business works. You'll fail. You'll come crawling back, and when you do, you'll take whatever position Marcus decides to give you." I told him I would not fail, and he smiled indulgently. and said, "They all say that, sweetheart. They all fail." That was the moment something fundamental shifted in me. Not anger, but clarity. I walked out of his office and never asked for his approval again, because I finally understood approval in that family was not support. It was control. The first 6 years nearly destroyed me. I lived in a studio apartment smaller than my childhood closet, slept on a mattress on the floor, survived on instant noodles and exhaustion, worked 18-hour days, teaching myself every layer of cybersecurity from the ground up, including coding, networking, threat analysis, compliance requirements, client onboarding, and crisis response. I made mistakes that almost ended everything. I partnered with a con artist who stole my first prototype and vanished. I lost 6 months of unpaid work to a client who never intended to honor a contract they assumed I would not enforce. I watched a server crash erase an entire demo days before a critical pitch, and every time I rebuilt from whatever scraps remained because failure was not an option I could afford. Meanwhile, my family watched from their comfortable towers, waiting for collapse. Marcus would swirl bourbon at Thanksgiving and ask if I was still playing with computers, reminding me Dad had an entry-level position open if I was ready to be realistic. My mother would add her manufactured concern, telling me she worried about my future and suggesting it was not too late to find a suitable husband instead. As if ambition were a phase to be outgrown, after year 4, I stopped attending family gatherings entirely because every ounce of energy spent defending myself was energy stolen from building my company. And build it? I did. Meridian developed proprietary intrusion detection systems capable of identifying and neutralizing threats faster than anything else in its market segment. We won our first government subcontract in year 5, our second in year 6, and by year 8, we had 63 employees, $18 million in annual revenue, and a reputation as one of the most innovative cybersecurity firms on the East Coast, and still my family knew nothing because I made sure of it. I used my married name Serena Mitchell in all public filings, press appearances, and industry coverage because I preferred success without witnesses from people who wanted me small. I preferred progress without permission, and that silence is what allowed them to believe the lie that nearly destroyed them. Because when people are committed to seeing you fail, they do not need proof, they need opportunity. And the moment Marcus discovered I had something worth destroying, he did not ask how big it was. He asked how fast he could interfere, because contempt does not fade with time. It calcifies, it waits, and it strikes when it believes the cost will be paid by someone else. And if you have ever been underestimated by people who should have known you best, if you have ever been laughed at for believing in something before it was profitable, pause right now and type justice in the comments. Because this story is not about talent, it is about what happens when entitlement collides with evidence, and in the next part, that collision becomes irreversible. The moment the Department of Homeland Security contract finalized, everything changed quietly, not publicly, not in celebration, but in gravity, because a company that protects critical infrastructure does not get room for error, and that was why I had kept it hidden, why Meridian's success was deliberate, but discreet. The $94 million contract was not just money, it was validation at a level my family could not comprehend, a multi-year agreement to implement our intrusion detection systems across power grids, water treatment facilities, emergency response networks, systems that could not afford to be compromised. And when Forbes ran the feature calling us the startup revolutionizing federal cybersecurity, I did not forward the article to anyone in my family. I did not correct their assumptions. I did not announce anything, because approval from people who root for your failure is a trap. And I had learned that lesson thoroughly. The bankruptcy petition arrived 4 weeks later, filed by Marcus, claiming Meridian owed him $1.8 million from a supposed investment in year 3. Defaulted repayment terms, insolvency, immediate creditor risk. Every single word was a lie. Marcus had never invested a penny, never expressed interest beyond mockery, never asked a question about my work unless it was framed as ridicule, and the documentation attached to the filing was pure fabrication loan agreements. I never signed contracts referencing accounts that did not exist, financial statements that contradicted every audit we had ever completed. And when I first saw it, I understood immediately what this was: not an attempt to collect money, but an attempt to delay, sabotage, introduce doubt before the scale of Meridian became undeniable. Patricia reviewed the filing calmly and told me forensic analysis would expose the fraud within days, but the filing itself created legal friction that could delay DHS implementation, and that delay could raise questions no one wanted to answer quickly. And that was the point. Marcus did not need to win, he needed to interfere. And when I asked how he could have known about the contract, the answer was obvious. My aunt worked at a law firm that handled some of our compliance documentation. She must have mentioned something casually at a family dinner, and that was enough, because when people like my brother hear that someone they dismissed has leverage, they do not ask questions, they act. And so, the court date arrived on a Wednesday morning in late October. I arrived early, dressed in a navy suit, understated, professional, commanding without being flashy, the kind of presence that does not ask for attention but assumes it. Patricia joined me at the defense table with 4 boxes of documentation, audited financials, bank records, tax filings, forensic handwriting analysis, every piece of reality my family had chosen to ignore. They arrived 20 minutes later, staging an entrance designed for impact. Marcus in a power suit, my mother dressed in somber black like she was attending a funeral, my father carrying himself like a patriarch betrayed by a wayward child. They did not acknowledge me. Not a glance, not a nod. I was not a daughter in that room. I was a problem to be eliminated. And when Marcus leaned toward his lawyer and said loudly enough for me to hear, finally facing consequences should have happened years ago, I did not react, because people who believe they are untouchable always mistake silence for weakness, and the hearing began. Marcus's lawyer presented the petition with theatrical gravity, describing my failing company, my supposed irresponsibility, my refusal to honor legitimate debts. My mother sobbed on cue. My father shook his head solemnly, and it was convincing if you did not know the truth. And when Judge Harrison reviewed our documentation, his expression shifted again, neutrality to confusion, to something harder, something controlled. And when he called counsel to the bench, Marcus's lawyer turned pale, while Patricia remained composed, nodding occasionally. And when the judge spoke again, his voice cut through the room, stating he was looking at audited financial statements from a Big Four accounting firm showing $118 million in annual revenue, bank records showing no investment from Marcus, and forensic handwriting analysis concluding every signature on the loan agreements was forged. My mother's performance collapsed instantly. My father stared at the table, and Marcus tried to interrupt, claiming I was lying, and the judge shut him down, stating that interfering with a federal contractor through fraudulent court filings could constitute a federal crime and potentially raise national security concerns. And that was the moment the room changed, because this was no longer a family dispute. This was a criminal exposure. And if you have ever watched someone realize too late that the story they rehearsed does not survive, facts, type justice in the comments right now, because in the next part, the consequences stop being theoretical and start being permanent. Once Judge Harrison framed the issue as potential interference with a federal contractor, the room lost all pretense of family drama and shifted into something colder and far more dangerous, because fraud against a private citizen is one thing, but fraud that touches national security does not stay local, and everyone in that courtroom understood it. At the same time, Marcus shot to his feet, objecting loudly, calling it ridiculous, insisting this was just his sister's little computer company. And the judge shut him down instantly, correcting him with a voice that carried authority and warning, stating, that Meridian Tech Solutions protected power grids, water treatment facilities, emergency response systems, and critical infrastructure, and that sabotaging such a company was not just fraud, it was a potential threat to public safety. And as he spoke, I watched the reality finally land on my father's face, the realization that this was no longer something he could smooth over with connections or money, that this was not a misunderstanding that could be corrected. Quietly, later the judge turned to me and addressed me, formally apologizing for the court's time being wasted by a malicious filing and assuring me that Meridian's reputation would not be affected by these proceedings, before announcing an immediate dismissal with prejudice and referring the matter to the United States Attorney's Office for investigation into bankruptcy, fraud, perjury, and attempted interference with a federal contractor. And with that single sentence, the performance collapsed entirely. Court officers approached Marcus and his attorney to discuss the referral, his lawyer visibly shaken, already calculating survival. My parents tried to slip out, quietly through a side door. The instinct of people who believed exposure only counted if it was witnessed, and I stopped them by calling their names evenly. Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, I assume you were aware of the scheme. My father turned slowly, his face gray, claiming this was Marcus's idea, that they were trying to help, that they believed his version of events, and I reminded them that they sat in the gallery nodding along while he attempted to destroy my company, that pretending ignorance after participation was not innocence. My mother's voice shrank, stripped of its usual imperious tone, saying they thought the company was failing, that Marcus said I had taken money from dangerous people, that they thought this would save me from myself, and I told them the truth they had avoided for years, that believing Marcus was easier than admitting they were wrong about me, that the $94 million contract was real, that the 63 employees who depended on Meridian were real, that the technology protecting American infrastructure was real, and that they had tried to destroy all of it because my success made them uncomfortable. And when my mother said my name pleading, I told them I was done, that whatever happened to Marcus legally was his problem, that whatever story they told themselves to sleep at night was theirs, but they were not to contact me again, because family does not try to bankrupt each other with forged documents in open court. And I walked out without looking back, because closure is not a conversation, it is a decision. And what followed moved faster than anyone expected. The federal investigation accelerated immediately. Marcus's lawyer, facing potential disbarment, cooperated, fully revealing that Marcus had approached him with the scheme, insisting Meridian was a pathetic failure that needed to be shut down before it could further embarrass the Whitmore name. The lawyer admitted negligence in accepting his client's claims without verification. But the primary fraud was entirely Marcus's design. Federal charges were filed within 8 weeks. Bankruptcy, fraud, perjury, attempted interference with a government contractor, charges carrying up to 20 years in federal prison. And my father emptied every political connection he had, along with a significant portion of his personal fortune, to secure a plea deal. Marcus pled guilty, reduced charges, 4 years in a minimum security facility, permanent removal from the family firm, and a federal felony conviction that would follow him for the rest of his life. The Whitmore wealth management firm survived, but barely, because Boston's financial community does not trust families associated with federal crimes. High net worth clients withdrew assets quietly but decisively. My father was forced into early retirement, and the firm was sold to a larger competitor at a fraction of its former value. And if you think consequences only matter when they are loud, understand this: the quiet ones last longer. And if you believe people who weaponize family ties to sabotage others should face accountability, type justice in the comments now, because in the next part, you'll see what happens after the dust settles and who is left standing when reputation collapses. After the charges were filed and the plea deal finalized, the noise faded quickly, but the damage did not, because reputations do not collapse in explosions, they erode in silence. And Boston's financial community is fluent in quiet judgment. The Whitmore name did not vanish overnight. It simply stopped. opening doors. Clients did not announce withdrawals, they scheduled reviews and never returned calls. Partners stopped inviting my father to closed-door meetings. Former allies spoke politely while distancing themselves, and within months, the firm that had once been the centerpiece of my father's identity was sold off at a valuation so low it would have been unthinkable. A year earlier, my father framed it publicly as a strategic retirement, but privately, it was exile. My mother retreated from her social circles after discovering sympathy is finite and scandal is contagious. Friends who once praised her strength avoided eye contact at charity events. Diana's carefully curated world cracked as well, because association does not respect nuance. Country club conversations turned cautious, invitations slowed, whispers followed her through rooms she had once dominated, and still none of them reached out to me, not to apologize, not to explain, not to ask how I was holding up, because accountability requires acknowledgement, and acknowledgement was something they had never learned. Meanwhile, Meridian moved forward uninterrupted, because reality does not pause for people who resent it. The DHS implementation proceeded on schedule. Our systems were deployed across critical infrastructure without incident, and what could have been reputational damage instead became reinforcement that we were resilient, that we were prepared, that we were trustworthy under pressure, and that mattered far more than vindication. Venture capital interest increased, not because of the scandal, but because of how we handled it quietly, professionally, decisively. And when the Wall Street Journal ran its follow-up piece, framing the case as an example of attempted interference with federal cybersecurity efforts, I gave one interview, carefully worded, focusing on legal implications rather than personal drama, because the story was never about betrayal, it was about boundaries and consequences. And when the reporter asked why I thought my brother had done it, I told truth without embellishment. Some people would rather destroy evidence than admit they were wrong. Success that contradicts their worldview is not something to celebrate. It is something to eliminate. And when asked whether I maintained any relationship with my biological family, I answered honestly that I had an extraordinary relationship with the family. I chose my husband, my employees, my partners, the people who believed in me when I had nothing but a vision and a garage, the people who celebrated my wins instead of manufacturing my failures. And that answer ended the interview because it left no room for reconciliation theater. And 8 months after Marcus began his sentence, my mother sent a letter 12 pages long, filled with justifications, softened language, and non-apologies, explaining that they never meant for things to go that far, that family should support each other through difficult times, that they only wanted what was best for me. And I did not respond, because explanations that arrive after consequences are not remorse, they are self-soothing. And then Diana reached out for the first time since the trial, writing carefully that she never agreed with how they treated me, that she had been too weak to say anything, too focused on her own life, but that she always knew I would prove them wrong, and the timing told the truth. She was trying to separate herself from the wreckage, to position herself as the sibling who had secretly supported me all along. And I replied with a single sentence: support expressed only after success is not support. It is positioning. But I appreciate the honesty about your silence, and I meant it. Growth has to begin somewhere, even when it begins too late. And if you have ever watched people rewrite their role in your story, once the ending becomes undeniable, pause right now and type justice in the comments, because the unicorn, most revealing part of success is not who celebrates with you, but who suddenly claims they always believed. Meridian Tech Solutions did not slow down after the trial, because momentum built on substance does not depend on approval. And over the next 2 years, the company expanded from 63 employees to 187 across 3 facilities, securing additional federal contracts that brought our total government agreements to $420 million over 7 years, while also expanding into private sector cybersecurity, protecting financial institutions, healthcare systems, and infrastructure that could not of Ford disruption. Fortune magazine listed us among the 50 most innovative companies in America. Forbes named me to its women leading tech list for the third consecutive year, and none of it felt surreal because it was built step by step, choice by choice, without shortcuts and without permission. Somewhere in the middle of that growth, my daughter was born, her named Grace, chosen for my husband James's grandmother. A woman who raised 4 children alone during the Depression, built a bakery from nothing, and taught her family that hard work always outlasts pedigree. And as I held Grace in the nursery of the home I built, a home purchased with money I earned in a neighborhood I chose, surrounded by people I selected instead of people I was born to, I understood with clarity that protection is a form of love, and that boundaries are not punishments, they are safeguards. I told her stories, even though she was too young to understand, about persistence, about building things that matter, about the difference between people who lift you up and people who try to drag you down. And I told her something else quietly, that her other grandparents would not be part of her life, not as revenge, not as punishment, but as protection, because she deserved to grow up surrounded by people who saw potential as something to nurture rather than something to suppress. And as she blinked at me with those unfocused newborn eyes, trusting and pure, I promised her I would be her biggest champion, not because she succeeded, but because she tried, because that is what family actually means. Not shared genetics, but shared belief, and that belief shaped everything that followed. Because while Marcus served his sentence, and my parents faded into irrelevance, Meridian continued to grow, continued to build, continued to prove that the only thing more powerful than family doubt is personal determination. And if you have ever had to choose between peace and proximity, between growth and guilt, pause right now and type justice in the comments, because choosing yourself is not abandonment, it is survival. And survival is the foundation of legacy. As the years passed after the trial, the narrative my family tried to impose collapsed completely. Not through confrontation, but through accumulation. Because real success does not need defense, it needs time. And Meridian continued to grow, quietly and relentlessly, becoming too visible, too stable, and too valuable to be dismissed as luck or rebellion. And with every new contract, every expansion, every headline, the original lie that I was irresponsible, reckless, or unserious became more absurd in hindsight, which mattered because reputations are rewritten not by argument, but by consistency. And what people began to understand was that the bankruptcy case had never been about money. It had been about control, about forcing me back into a hierarchy I had already outgrown. And once that lens shifted, the courtroom moment took on new meaning, not as a dramatic twist, but as an inevitability, because evidence eventually corners entitlement. And when people later asked me whether it hurt that my parents never acknowledged their mistake, I told the truth, that the hurt had ended years before the trial, because indifference heals faster than betrayal, and sabotage only stings while you still believe someone has authority over your future. And by the time they filed forged documents against me, that authority was already gone. What remained was habit, entitlement, and fear. And fear is what drives people to destroy, rather than reflect. Because admitting they were wrong would have required my family to dismantle the identity they had built around superiority and correctness, and that is a loss some people will risk prison to avoid. And watching that play out publicly did not make me feel vindicated. It made me feel resolved. Because closure does not come from watching others fall. It comes from realizing you no longer need them to stand. And that realization shaped everything that followed. How I led, how I hired, how I trusted, and how I protected what I built. Because I understood that the most dangerous people are not competitors. They are those who feel entitled to you without earning proximity, and that awareness became policy at Meridian. Boundaries documented, communication, accountability at every level, not because I was hardened, but because I was clear, and that clarity created safety, not just for me, but for the people who depended on the percented company for their livelihoods, because leadership is not about charisma, it is about foresight. And foresight is what my family lacked when they believed a forged petition could undo 9 years of discipline and sacrifice. And as Meridian crossed new thresholds, expanding operations, securing long-term contracts, and becoming embedded in systems that required trust, at the highest level I watched from a distance as the Whitmore name faded, not dramatically, not tragically, but quietly, which is how irrelevance usually arrives, because without credibility, connections rot, and without trust, prestige is decoration. And my parents had mistaken appearance for immunity. For so long they believed consequences were something that happened to other people, until they didn't. And that lesson landed slowly, but permanently, because no amount of explanation or justification could undo the public record, and public records are unforgiving in a way private conversations never are. And when Diana attempted to reposition herself after the fact, claiming quiet support, I understood the instinct without accepting the rewrite, because survival often masquerades as solidarity when outcomes become inconvenient, and I did not resent her for it. I simply refused to participate in the fiction. Because history matters, not to punish, but to preserve accuracy. And accuracy is a form of respect to yourself. And if you are watching this, having lived through something similar, waiting for acknowledgement that never comes, understand, your peace does not depend on someone else's confession. It depends on your decision to stop negotiating with people who benefit from misunderstanding you. And if this resonates, pause right now and type justice in the comments. Because justice is not always punishment, sometimes it is permanence, the permanence of truth, the permanence of record, and the permanence of knowing that what you built cannot be taken by people who never believed in it in the first place. By the time Meridian crossed its 11th anniversary, the story had fully inverted from what my family once believed inevitable, because the company was no longer a startup that could be dismissed as experimental or fragile. It was infrastructure, and infrastructure does not bend to ego or nostalgia. It demands reliability, discipline, and foresight, qualities that had been absent in the people who tried to destroy it. And as we expanded to 187 employees across 3 facilities, securing long-term federal contracts, totaling $420 million over 7 years, I watched the distance between who I had been in that courtroom and who I had become stretch into something permanent, not emotional distance but structural distance, the kind that cannot be crossed with apologies or explanations, because the world I occupied now required trust at a level my family had proven they could not handle. And when Fortune listed Meridian among the 50 most innovative companies in America, and Forbes named me to its women leading tech list again, the recognition felt almost incidental, not because it was unearned, but because it was secondary to stability. The systems we protected, the people we employed, the families whose livelihoods depended on our work. That was the weight that mattered. And that weight reframed everything, including how I understood the past. Because ambition that survives sabotage is not arrogance, it is resilience. And resilience rewrites memory, turning moments that once felt like rejection into markers of escape. And that clarity sharpened after my daughter was born, because legacy stops being theoretical the moment someone else's future depends on your decisions. And holding grace, in the nursery of the home I built, a home purchased with money I earned in a neighborhood I chose, surrounded by people I selected, instead of people I was assigned. I understood something with a finality I had never felt before, that boundaries are not walls, they are filters, and protection is not cruelty, it is responsibility. And when I told her quietly that her other grandparents would not be part of her life, it was not spoken with bitterness, but with certainty. Because exposing a child to people who see potential as a threat is not forgiveness, it is negligence. And I refuse to confuse shared blood with shared values, because values are what shape safety, and safety is what allows growth. and that realization stripped away any lingering guilt I had carried, because guilt only survives when you still believe access is owed, and access is never owed, it is earned, and my family forfeited theirs the moment they chose sabotage over accountability. And while Marcus served his sentence, and my parents faded into irrelevance, the absence did not feel like loss. It felt like quiet, because noise often disguises instability, and stability has a sound of its own, and that sound is calm. And when people later asked whether I worried about regret, whether I feared looking back and wishing I had left the door open, I answered honestly that regret is usually rooted in fantasy, not reality. The fantasy that someone might change without incentive, without consequence, without effort, and the courtroom had been their moment of truth, not because they were exposed publicly, but because they were offered a choice to stop, and they did not take it. And choices matter because patterns repeat until interrupted, and I chose interruption. I chose clarity. I chose to build forward without dragging the past behind me, and that choice paid dividends, not just professionally, but personally, because leadership grounded in self-trust does not overcompensate, it does not seek approval, it does not explain itself endlessly. And that steadiness became the culture of Meridian, a place where performance mattered more than pedigree, where documentation mattered more than narrative, and where preparation was treated as respect for the future. And that culture attracted people who valued substance over status, who recognized that building things that matter requires humility and vigilance, because entitlement is the enemy of resilience. And watching the contrast between what Meridian became and what the Whitmore name dissolved into reinforced the truth I had lived quietly for years. That success does not need witnesses from the people who doubted you. It needs alignment with the people who build alongside you. And if you are watching this, having had to walk away from people who shared your last name to protect what you were building, understand this. You are not abandoning family. You are defining it. And definition is power. And if that resonates, pause and type justice in the comments. Because sometimes justice is not a verdict. It is spied, the life that continues after one. Looking back now, the most revealing part of the entire ordeal was not the courtroom or the charges or even the sentence. It was the moment afterward when nothing dramatic happened and life simply continued, because that is where truth lives. Not in spectacle but in endurance, and what endured was Meridian, not the narrative my family tried to impose, and what faded was not just their influence but their relevance. Because relevance cannot survive without integrity, and integrity cannot be faked indefinitely. And as the company matured, the early years of dismissal began to read like foreshadowing rather than trauma, because every insult, every dismissal, every condescending smile had been evidence of a worldview that could not tolerate deviation, and that worldview had no place in a system that rewarded adaptation, foresight, accountability, and as a result, the contrast sharpened over time between what was built on entitlement and what was built on effort. And that contrast became unavoidable to anyone paying attention, including the broader business community, which quietly recalibrated its understanding of what had happened, because people in those circles are fluent in subtext, and once the facts were established, no one needed commentary. The silence itself was instructive. Invitations stopped, references dried up, and the Whitmore name became something people remembered vaguely rather than relied on. And that shift did more to dismantle their authority than any punishment ever could, because authority is sustained by trust. And once trust evaporates, legacy becomes history, and history becomes cautionary. And that realization reframed the way I understood justice, because justice was not Marcus serving time or my parents losing status. It was the permanence of the record, the fast inability to rewrite what had been done, and the inability to reclaim what had been forfeited, because actions taken in arrogance have a way of closing doors permanently, and that permanence was what they had underestimated, believing everything could be smoothed over later as it always had been, and that belief was their final mistake. And as Meridian's footprint expanded, and its role in protecting infrastructure became more entrenched, the idea that it could ever have been dismissed as a hobby bordered on absurd. And that absurdity carried weight, because it exposed how wrong they had been at a foundational level, not about my competence, but about how the world actually works. Because the world does not reward certainty without evidence. It rewards preparation, humility, and responsiveness. And those are qualities that cannot be inherited, and that understanding shaped the way I spoke about the case publicly, because I refused to frame it as betrayal or revenge. Instead, I framed it as a lesson in systems, because systems reveal character under pressure, and the system of family I came from collapsed when challenged, while the system I built held. And that distinction mattered, because people watching from the detectives outside were not choosing sides emotionally, they were assessing outcomes, and outcomes tell the truth faster than testimony. And when asked whether I believed reconciliation was possible, I answered honestly that reconciliation requires accountability, and accountability requires acknowledgement, and acknowledgement was something my parents had never practiced, and that absence was not something I could fix for them, because growth that is outsourced is not growth. It is dependency. And dependency was what I had spent my entire adult life dismantling, and that clarity allowed me to move forward without bitterness, because bitterness is a form of attachment, and I had released attachment to their approval long before the courtroom, and that release created space for something better, something chosen, something reciprocal, and that is where fulfillment actually lives. And if you are watching this, wondering whether it is worth enduring the long, quiet years of being underestimated, understand this. Those years are not wasted. They are preparation. And preparation is what makes moments like the courtroom inevitable, rather than lucky. And if you have ever been tempted to confront rather than document, to argue rather than build, pause and type justice in the comments, because the most powerful response to disbelief is not persuasion, it is proof. And proof takes time. But time is loyal to those who keep going. They hired a lawyer expecting to finally prove I was the failure they had always claimed. I was expecting the courtroom to become their validation stage, the place where my life's work would be reduced to a mistake that could be corrected by authority and paperwork. And instead, that room became the exact opposite. It became the place where their certainty collapsed under documentation, where entitlement met evidence and lost. And what matters most about that day is not that the judge recognized Meridian from Forbes or that the contract number stunned the room. It is that the truth had been ready long before anyone else noticed, because truth does not rush. It accumulates quietly, waiting for the moment it is required. And when it was required, it did not ask for permission. It simply stood. And that is the part people misunderstand about justice. They think it is loud or immediate or emotional, when in reality, justice is structural. It is the alignment of reality and consequence. And the courtroom was only the visible intersection of years of invisible work, years of restraint, preparation, and refusal to be distracted by people who believed their opinion outweighed my effort. And that is why the ending of this story does not belong to them. It belongs to the systems that held when tested. Meridian did not survive because I defended it. Emotionally, it survived because it was built correctly, because it was audited, documented, compliant, resilient, and prepared for scrutiny at a level my family never imagined would be applied to them. And that asymmetry was the real reckoning, because people who live by narrative often forget that systems do not care about narrative, and the federal system especially does not care about family, loyalty, or wounded pride. It cares about records, timelines, and facts. And those facts told a story no one in my family had prepared for. And as Marcus serves his sentence, and my parents fade into irrelevance, the temptation for observers is to frame this as triumph or revenge. But it is neither. It is resolution, because resolution is what happens when you stop trying to be understood by people invested in misunderstanding you and instead build something that speaks for itself. And Meridian continues to do exactly that, growing, expanding, protecting infrastructure, and employing people who will never know the problems, family drama that tried to derail it because it does not matter. And that is perhaps the most complete form of justice, indifference earned through excellence. And when I watch my daughter sleep, knowing she will grow up without the instability of people who view potential as a threat, I understand that the cycle ended not in a courtroom, but in a nursery, in the quiet certainty that she will never have to prove her worth to people who confuse control with care. And that certainty is the legacy I wanted. Not headlines, not validation, not reconciliation, but protection and clarity. And if there is one truth this story leaves behind, it is this: the only thing more powerful than family doubt is personal determination backed by preparation, because doubt collapses when confronted by evidence, and evidence is built day by day, choice by choice, long before anyone is watching. And they gave me every one opportunity to fail, every dismissal, every insult, every attempt to pull me back into a role they designed, and in doing so they gave me something far more valuable than support. They gave me distance, and distance is where perspective lives, and perspective is what allowed me to build something worth recognizing, worth protecting, and worth defending. And if you are watching this, having lived under someone else's certainty about your limitations, understand this: you do not need their permission to outgrow them. You only need to keep building until reality speaks louder than opinion. And if this story resonated with you, if you believe people who try to sabotage others should face consequences, and if you believe preparation outlasts privilege, type justice in the comments, because justice is not about winning an argument, it is about building a life that makes the argument irrelevant.